Step 2. Next I'm going to try to convince you of the existence of a god. At least a god, if not multiple. I'm not going for the existence of the God of the Bible yet. Just the existence of a god, at least, of some kind. So, when I say that I'm going to try to convince you of the existence of a god, what do I even mean by that? We could use all kinds of definitions for what qualifies as a god. So, I'm going to start with that. When I say a god, what I am referring to is a being that is sentient, self-aware. It is very powerful in terms of its ability to bend the universe to its will. And it would be considered a god by the ancient humans of the time periods around the time of the Bible being written. So the reason why we're going for this is because since I'll be talking about the biblical God later, we're going to use what they would call a god, since they're the ones who wrote the book. I also want to point out that the Bible tells us that those people were very much into idolatry, so it didn't take a whole lot to convince those people that something was a god or not. They would worship all kinds of things. So really, I'm not going for necessarily right now this all-powerful god. Right now I'm going for really even some sort of Greek god would be good enough to qualify. In order to convince you of the existence of at least a god of some kind, I'm going to start in an odd position. I'm going to ask you if you had to put your finger on what science's best stab at it would be to explain where we all came from, what would you think it would be? Probably evolution, right? That's pretty much science's best explanation that they've come up with, at least so far. So, I'm going to ask you to start by assuming that evolution is true. Now, I know what you're thinking. He's going to try to convince me that a god exists while assuming that evolution is where we all came from, and he's going to talk about the God of the Bible later. Okay, how's that going to work? Well, wait. I'm not telling you to necessarily believe in and assume that evolution is true and that's actually where we all came from necessarily. I'm just asking you to assume that for the purposes of this discussion for now. So what does evolution suggest? Evolution suggests really that there are going to be two forces at work here. One being mutation. Mutation caused by things that cause mutation, mutagens, as well as radiation. Also, improper replication of DNA. Those things leading to either exceedingly minor or really quite major changes to individual members of a species. Those mutations will be beneficial or not. If they are beneficial, they will increase a particular creature that is a member of a species. They will increase its likelihood of being able to reproduce and thus passing its genes with possibly that mutation to the next generation, thus perpetuating that mutation. If the mutation is detrimental, it will decrease that particular creature's likelihood of passing its genes on. If the mutation is neither detrimental nor beneficial, then it doesn't really impact one way or the other. And if that particular creature does, by chance, manage to survive to reproduce itself, then the genes would be passed on and possibly show up in a later generation. The other force at work here is natural selection. Natural selection will suggest that really the strong shall live and the weak shall die. And if there is a creature that is a stronger member of its species, it will be more likely to survive, to reproduce, and pass its genes on to the next generation. And if there is a creature that is weaker, it will be less likely to survive, to pass its genes on to the next generation. This creates a weed out process where only the stronger creatures are passing their genes on to the next generation, suggesting that each successive generation will be slightly more suitably adapted to the environment in which it exists. Now, what drives species to become ever increasingly complex is that evolution is essentially in a constant battle against itself, because a species will be in competition with another species for territory, resources, mates, really food, killing each other to eat them, or competing over maybe something else they eat. Evolution could even happen even if there's only one species and it's simply in competition with itself for resources and mates. The result is that you have one species that looks at another species, and these two species are considering each other, and one says, well, I'm going to eat you, and the other one says, no, you're not, and the other one says, well, I'm going to grow these teeth so that I'm going to be able to eat you, and then the other one says, oh yeah, well, I'm going to develop this thick hide. My skin is going to get tougher so that I have armor so that your teeth can't eat me. And then the other one says, oh yeah, well, I'm going to develop this this poison stinger so that I can pierce your tough hide and be able to kill you with the poison. And then the other one says, no, because I'm going to develop a resistance to your poison. And then the first one says, well, I'm going to get bigger muscles to be able to trample you underfoot. And then the other one says, oh yeah, well, I'm going to get bigger muscles to be able to defend against that. And then the other one says, well, I'm going to get even bigger than you. And then the other one says, well, I'm going to get bigger too. And so they get increasingly complex and more complicated and more intelligent and everything else you can imagine to be able to continue this arms race against each other until they become what we see today. Now I'm going to ask you to continue to extrapolate that process and unfold it until you get to its logical end. Even for this planet, what do you end up with? You end up with a super complex, super intelligent being. What you end up with is a god. Now you might say, wait a minute, I don't know if evolution can produce a god. To yield a god from evolution, maybe evolution can't do that, because after all, evolution is just trying to make a creature ideally suited to the environment in which it exists. But evolution is not satisfied with just existing in a small, contained area, in a closed system. Life is always trying to push to new boundaries and to new places where it wasn't able to exist before. If you look at just the fact that life exists in Antarctica or the North Pole, life has had to push hard to get creatures to be able to have a sustainable ecosystem in places like that. Consider that in places like the North Pole and Antarctica, there are fungi, algae, even though the sun will go down for 6 months at a time. And things eat those fungus and algae, and then larger animals eat those, and then larger animals eat those, and they have a sustainable ecosystem, even in the absence of light, for 6 months at a time. Life and evolution are not going to stop pushing. And if you think that evolution cannot yield a god, did evolution create humanity? Because where do you think we're going to be in another 10,000 years? So, if evolution created us, and give us another 10,000 years and we'll be gods, well, if evolution created us, then evolution can yield a god. And remember now, of course we would look at ourselves and say, we're not gods. Well, of course not. But remember, we're going by what the ancients of biblical times would consider to be a god. So, if you take a human from 10,000 years in the future and you time travel them back to biblical days and you set them up and ask the ancients, would you consider this, given all of their abilities and technological advancements and everything they can do, would you consider this person to be a god? Especially if they claimed to be a god in front of those people. Would those people believe that's a god? Yes, they really probably would. Really, I only say a human from 10,000 years in the future to be safe. Realistically, you could almost take a human now and send them back in time to biblical times, and they might consider that person to be a god, or at least some kind of wizard or something. Look at this magic tablet that I have here. Look at that. Here, look at this. You see this, ancients? This is a magical necklace. This gemstone on the end of the necklace here, it's a flash drive, except you don't know what that is, so I'm just going to call it a magical gemstone on the end. And it holds in it a massive amount of information, arcane information. So therefore, if we are assuming that evolution is correct and true, then can evolution and will evolution yield a god? Yes, because it yielded us. And we're going by what the humans of the biblical times would accept as a god were it to interact with them.